The stable door fought him, hinges screaming against wind that wanted to tear everything loose and scatter it across Montana darkness. Marcus Weylan leaned his weight into the push, lantern swinging wild in his other hand, casting shadows that lurched and twisted like living things. He'd heard something. A sound that wasn't wind, wasn't his horse, wasn't anything he could name, but recognized nonetheless as trouble. What he found made his breath stop. A body sprawled in the straw, massive beyond anything he'd expected. Shoulders broad as a yoke meant for oxen, back carved with muscle that spoke of a life spent riding and fighting and surviving things that would have killed softer people. But it was the marks that held his attention. Purple welts crossed her back in patterns deliberate and cruel, the kind left by men who enjoyed their work. Her wrists bore rope burns worn down to raw meat. When she lifted her head, eyes caught the lantern light and threw it back amber and fierce, and absolutely exhausted. Apache. Warrior bloodline if the bearing meant anything. And tall, easily 7 feet, when she rose to her knees, shoulders hunching to fit beneath stable rafters, meant for horses, not giants. "Stay back." Her voice came rough, broken by shallow breathing and cold that had worked its way into her bones. English spoken with the careful precision of someone who'd learned it as a weapon, as armor, as the language of enemies. Marcus didn't move back, but he didn't reach for the pistol at his hip either. He just stood there, taking in the snapped bindings dangling from her wrists, the torn wounds, the quiet desperation burning behind those amber eyes like banked coals waiting for wind. "You're on my land," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "Don't want trouble from you or anyone else." She watched him like a wolf watches, calculating distance and danger, muscles coiled beneath exhaustion. "You hungry?" The question seemed to confuse her, more than threats would have. Marcus crouched, careful to stay out of reach, and set a bowl of cold stew on the stable floor. Then he stood and backed toward the door, giving her space, giving her choice. "If you want it, eat. If you don't, freeze. Up to you." After he'd gone, after his footsteps had faded and the lantern light had retreated to the house beyond, she crawled forward. Her hands shook so badly she could barely grip the bowl. But she ate, and the food was the first kindness she'd known in months. When Marcus returned at dawn, she spoke. The words came quiet, testing. "You won't hand me over to them." It wasn't quite a question. More like she was trying out the possibility, seeing if it held weight or collapsed like everything else. Marcus pulled hay from a bale, tossed it to his horse. "Don't sell people. Never have. Won't start now." 3 days the storm raged. 3 days the world outside became nothing but wind and white and cold that killed if you gave it any chance at all. Marcus moved her to the cabin, not because he trusted her, but because another night in the stable would finish what the men who'd marked her back had started. "Takoda?" she said when he asked her name. Just the one word, offered like payment for shelter. She slept near the door where drafts cut sharpest, keeping the small knife he'd given her when he'd bandaged her wounds. Marcus didn't object. Anyone who survived to adulthood out here had learned to trust instinct before trusting people, to sleep light and wake ready. By the third morning, snow had buried the water trough, turned fences into white suggestions of where boundaries might be. The cabin had become a wooden box trapped in an ocean of white, and they were the only two people in the world who mattered. Marcus was feeding the stove when Takoda spoke. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" He looked at her, 7 feet of warrior woman, who could probably snap his neck without effort, and shrugged. "You're big, strong, but the cold's scarier than you'll ever be." That made her stare, puzzled. She'd never met anyone who spoke to an Apache warrior with such ease, such complete lack of the fear or hatred or desire she'd come to expect from white men. Later, while Marcus stacked firewood, he said, half joking, "Storm keeps us trapped much longer. Folks in town will start saying I've gone and started a family before spring." Takoda turned, and for the first time something like humor touched her face. The corner of her mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close. Cold and proud and absolutely certain. "I would sooner sleep with a rattlesnake," she said, each word precise as a blade, "than have children with an ordinary man." Marcus laughed, not offended in the slightest. "Hearing it out loud, I have to admit that does sound about right." Takoda scoffed, but when she turned away, her eyes held something that wasn't quite disdain. Something closer to surprise, that this weathered rancher didn't flinch from her size or her scorn. Didn't try to make himself bigger by making her smaller. If you're drawn to stories where two people from different worlds forge something stronger than either could build alone, where the frontier strips away everything except what's real, hit that subscribe button. These tales of unexpected bonds don't tell themselves, and your support keeps them coming. Now back to the cabin, where Winter was teaching 2 stubborn souls that survival sometimes meant lowering your guard. That night, the storm intensified, wind howling around the cabin like something alive and hunting. Marcus added wood to the stove, draped his thickest blanket over Takoda's shoulders. "Don't move too much, or those wounds will tear open again." She looked at him through flickering firelight, and for the first time her gaze wasn't checking for threats. "Why are you doing this?" "Don't let people die in my house," Marcus said simply. "That's the whole philosophy." Outside, the storm raged across the Bitterroot Mountains. Inside the cramped cabin, distance between 2 wounded people began to shrink, even if neither would admit it yet. Takoda slept restlessly. Always had. Probably always would. Her breathing would catch, go ragged. Sometimes she'd jolt awake, as if striking down invisible enemies. Marcus noticed, but never asked. Some wounds you learned not to poke at. Some stories people told only when ready, or never at all. One evening, when the storm had eased slightly, Marcus sat sharpening his hunting knife, flames throwing shadows across his sun-damaged face. After long minutes of silence, it was Takoda who spoke first. "I was not born to hide in small houses." Her voice carried the weight of everything she'd lost. "I am Takoda of the Usen bloodline, trained from childhood to ride, to track, to fight, never to bow." Marcus set down the blade. "But right now, you're running." She didn't bristle at that, just sighed, the sound carrying mountains of exhaustion. "They caught me alone, ambushed me, tied me, and sold me through 3 territories, like livestock. Those filthy men, and their eyes." She stopped, jaw tight. I would rather have frozen in the snow than fall back into their hands. Marcus said nothing, just listened the way he'd learned to listen to horses, with his whole attention, no judgment. Takoda touched one of the welts on her shoulder. I fought back. Killed one, wounded two more. But there were too many. They beat me until my knife broke. She looked at her empty hands, as if the weapon might materialize. I've never lost a fight before that day. Marcus stood, walked to his cabinet, pulled out a tin of salve his mother had taught him to make before she died. He set it in Takoda's hands without ceremony. She looked surprised. You're not going to ask anything else? What happened doesn't make you weaker. Marcus's voice was low, steady as bedrock. Just tells me how strong you really are to still be breathing. Takoda stared at him, and something in her face, usually carved from stone, softened, just for a moment. Just enough for Marcus to see the woman beneath the warrior, the person beneath the armor. Later, as Marcus settled back by the fire, Takoda spoke again. Her voice came quiet, almost lost in the flame's crackle. No one has ever treated me this way. Without wanting something. Without fear or desire, or the need to prove themselves stronger. She paused. Why? Marcus didn't turn around. You're breathing. You need somewhere safe to heal. That's reason enough. Takoda watched him for a long time. The suspicion in her gaze was fading, replaced by something she didn't want to name. Something that felt dangerous in an entirely different way than men with ropes and cruel hands. Outside, the snowy night began to calm. Inside Takoda's chest, something was shifting. Walls she'd built to survive were developing cracks, and light was starting to seep through. The afternoon sky turned dark hours before sunset should have arrived. Marcus was splitting wood behind the cabin when hoofbeats cut through the snow's muffled quiet. Fast, purposeful, carrying bad intentions like a smell you could taste. He squinted toward the trail. Two men on horseback, coming straight for his property, like they knew exactly where they were headed. Marcus recognized the type before he recognized the faces. Bounty hunters, slavers, the kind who tracked Apache refugees and sold them to the highest bidder. One of them wore a grin that made Marcus's stomach turn. Afternoon, Weylan. The voice carried the false friendliness of men used to getting their way. Heard you might be harboring some valuable property. Marcus stood tall, axe still in hand. You boys took a wrong turn. Nothing here concerns you. The second one, younger but meaner, glanced at the cabin. That Apache woman belongs to us. Think you can hide her? We've been tracking her for 2 weeks. She doesn't belong to anyone. The older one laughed. Out here, Weylan, it's simple arithmetic. Whoever catches, owns. And since you're holding her, that means you owe us. Marcus shifted his stance, letting the axe rest easy in his grip. His voice dropped to something flat and cold. If you come back here, you better bring papers signed by a federal judge and a priest for good measure. He paused. Let that sink in. And even then, I might still send you off with bullets. The two men hesitated. In Marcus's steady gaze, they saw something that made their certainty waver. The calm of a man who'd buried more than a few bodies in this valley, who knew exactly how far he'd go, and had made peace with it years ago. They exchanged looks, pulled reins, backed their horses up. You haven't seen the end of this, the older one called as they turned. As hoofbeats faded, the cabin door creaked open. Takoda stood there, her massive frame filling the doorway, amber eyes still trembling from fear she'd fought to suppress. "You did that for me." Her voice came soft, but heavy with the weight of understanding what it meant, what it would cost him. Marcus looked at her. "Wasn't for you. Was against them. There's a difference." But Takoda shook her head. "No, there isn't." She stepped fully outside, and in the gray afternoon light, she looked like something carved from the mountains themselves, powerful and ancient and utterly certain. "If you did that, then I'll stay. Not hiding. Staying." Marcus nodded slowly. In a place colder than these mountains had any right to be, something warmer than fire was beginning to kindle. That night, the storm returned with vengeance. Wind so violent, the entire cabin shuddered with each gust. Snow thickened until the window showed nothing but white static. Marcus bolted the door, dragged a chair against it as extra insurance. The fireplace burned hot, but cold still crept through every gap in the walls, turning breath to visible clouds. Takoda sat against the far wall, her large frame trembling slightly. Wounds still not fully healed, body exhausted from weeks of running and fighting and surviving. Marcus threw more wood on the fire, then brought his thickest blanket. "Try to stay warm. Storm like this might last till morning." Takoda pulled the blanket close, but her eyes stayed on Marcus. Something was shifting in her expression, some calculation being made. "This spot is still cold," she said quietly. Marcus settled into his chair near the fire, rubbing his hands for warmth. "Just make it through tonight. Weather should break by dawn." Takoda kept watching him. Her face, usually rigid as mountain stone, had softened just enough to show something beneath. Weariness, yes, but also hesitation, vulnerability she rarely let surface. She shifted, pulled the blanket open wider. "2 people close will stay warmer." It wasn't quite an invitation, wasn't quite a statement. Somewhere between both. Marcus froze. He knew she was right. He'd survived winter campaigns during the war the same way, sharing body heat with soldiers who'd been strangers hours before. But this was different. This was a 7-foot Apache warrior, and he was just a rancher, trying to do right. "You sure?" Takoda didn't answer with words, just held the blanket open, the gesture carrying a kind of trust that was harder to give than any weapon. Marcus crossed the small space and lay down beside her. The moment they touched, warmth spread fast. Takoda's body carried heat like a forge, her skin smelling of wood smoke and sage and something wild he couldn't name. The small cabin filled with a strange safety neither had felt in longer than they could remember. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by wind and fire. Then Takoda turned to face him, those amber eyes reflecting flames. She reached out, touched his weathered cheek with surprising gentleness. "I trust you." The words carried more weight than any Marcus had ever heard. He brought his hand to the back of her neck, pulled her close until their lips met. Slow, deliberate, warm enough to melt every layer of ice either had built around their hearts. When they pulled apart, breath mingling like smoke, Marcus whispered, "You're safe here. Always." For the first time since childhood, Takoda rested her head on another person's shoulder and let every defense drop. Winter at last loosened its stranglehold. The first patches of melting snow trickled down mountainsides, revealing brown earth and trembling grass blades. Marcus's cabin, buried in white for months, now seemed to re-emerge into the living world. Marcus opened the door to welcome the first real warmth of spring. But before he could step outside, he saw Takoda standing on the porch, her broad shoulders nearly blocking the morning light. She was looking at her hands, then slowly placed one large palm over her belly. The gesture stopped Marcus cold. "Are you all right?" Takoda turned. Her eyes no longer carried that warrior's fierce wariness, but something deeper, calmer. She took Marcus's hand and placed it over her stomach. Beneath his palm, warmth radiated, different somehow, alive with promise. "There is a child," Takoda said slowly, as if each word was a vow she was making to the world. Marcus stood still, everything he'd thought and not dared to think rushing through him at once. But what came out was simple, just a smile, rare on his weathered face. "Well then," he squeezed her hand gently. "We'll need more room. I'll build a cradle, a strong one." Takoda looked at him for a long time, so long Marcus thought she might take the words back. But then she placed her hand over his chest, where his heart hammered hard beneath. "I used to think you were weak," she confessed. "Small, not worthy of warrior blood." Marcus exhaled. "Yeah, I figured." But Takoda shook her head. "Now I understand. True strength isn't in never fearing. It's in not running away, in not asking for anything in return, and staying when leaving would be easier." Marcus let out a quiet laugh. "That's because I love you." For the first time, Takoda's face truly softened. No longer warrior, no longer wounded giant. Just a woman standing at the beginning of her own spring. "And I choose you," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any battle cry. The spring wind swept through the open door, rustling curtains. Marcus squeezed her hand. "Then let's get started. We've got a home to build." News traveled faster than wind across Montana grassland. Rancher Marcus Weylan marries a giant Apache woman. That single sentence was enough to pack the small church in Redemption Falls, with curious onlookers who'd never shown interest in anyone's wedding before. The sun wasn't blinding that day, just bright enough to illuminate the traditional dress Takoda had chosen. Lined with Apache beads that caught light and threw it back like stars, following the powerful lines of her 7-foot frame. When she stepped down from the wagon, the crowd fell silent. Some jaws dropped. Some stepped back. Some whispered variations of, "I've never seen a woman so tall." But when Takoda walked to stand beside Marcus, stood beside him like a mountain beside a steadfast river, no one felt fear anymore. What they saw instead was something strange and deeply beautiful. Peace between two souls, fate had thrown together like some cosmic joke that turned out to be profound truth. Reverend Stone's hands trembled as he opened his Bible. His eyes rose to meet Takoda's, nearly tall enough to brush the chapel rafters, then dropped to Marcus, the man holding a hand almost twice the size of his own. "Son," he said softly, "are you certain?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He squeezed Takoda's hand, never taking his eyes from her face. "She saved me from loneliness I didn't know was killing me. I'm just doing my part now. choosing to love her every day for the rest of my life. The chapel erupted not in laughter or mockery, but in surprised murmurs. No one had expected the taciturn rancher to speak something so plain and powerful. Then it was Takoda's turn. She stepped forward, her shadow falling across wooden pews. Her voice rang out, deep and steady, carrying the authority of someone who'd never bowed to anyone. I choose this man not because he is stronger than me, but because his heart never backed down. Not from winter, not from men with guns, not from me. She placed her hand over her belly. And my child will know a father who stands in the gap when others run. No one breathed. Every sound in the chapel was swallowed by the weight of that moment. Reverend Stone cleared his throat. Then, in the name of the Lord, I pronounce you husband and wife. Cheers erupted. Applause crashed against rafters. Horses, neighing outside, joined the celebration. Marcus leaned up. Takoda leaned down, and they kissed beneath the old chapel roof that had never known a love story quite like this one. That spring, Bitterroot Valley felt transformed. Not because trees were budding or streams thawing, but because Marcus Weylan's cabin now echoed with laughter, carried warmth it had never known, the warmth of family. Marcus stood in the yard, hammering planks for the new room. The rhythm rang steady and honest, like the man himself. Near him, Takoda gathered dried grass, her hands occasionally drifting to her belly, where small life grew daily. She'd grown used to stairs when she walked through Redemption Falls, an Apache woman over 7 feet tall, muscles carved like mountain stone, but eyes gentler than anyone expected. She never needed to explain herself. Her choice had been made clear, as footprints pressed into soft earth. You should rest, Marcus said, setting down his hammer. Wind's picking up. I'm fine, Takoda replied, though she paused long enough for him to check if she was cold. His hand rested on her shoulder, small but firm. Fine by my measure means not fine at all. Takoda laughed, once rare, now familiar on their porch. Since when did you get so stubborn? Probably around the time I married a woman who could lift me with one hand. Takoda laughed again, bent down, kissed his forehead. She didn't speak often, but every gesture held tenderness a warrior like her had ever showed the outside world. Evening came golden, sunlight spilling like honey across hills. Takoda stepped onto the porch and looked over the wide valley, once a place she'd run from, nearly died in. Now wind played gently through her hair. Marcus came behind her, wrapped arms around her waist. What are you looking at? Takoda didn't turn, just kept watching the sky, as if seeing her entire life unfolding in the horizon ahead. This place feels close. Close to what? Takoda placed her strong hand over his, squeezed. Close to you. Close to peace. Close to home. The cabin at the valley's edge glowed with firelight. Smoke curled into spring air like a signal. A man, once lonely. A woman, once hunted. No longer running. They'd carved out peace for themselves where winter couldn't win, where the past no longer held chains, where a child grew inside Takoda and a new future was being written, one day at a time. 6 months later, on a night when autumn painted the valley in copper and gold, Takoda's labor began. Marcus had prepared as best he could, boiled water, gathered clean cloth, fetched the midwife from town despite her obvious fear of delivering a half Apache child. The labor was long. Takoda didn't scream. Warriors didn't. But Marcus heard her breathing change, saw pain carve lines into her face that had survived so much already. He stayed beside her, held her hand, whispered things he'd never said aloud about hope and future, and the family they'd built from winter and stubbornness. When the baby finally came, small and squalling and perfect, Marcus felt something in his chest crack open. The midwife wrapped the child, and Marcus saw his son's face for the first time. Dark hair, his mother's amber eyes, skin that would tan darker than his father's, but lighter than his mother's. "He's beautiful," Marcus whispered, placing the baby in Takoda's arms. Takoda looked down at their son, and tears, the first Marcus had ever seen from her, tracked down her face. "He will be strong," she said quietly, "and kind, like his father." "And brave," Marcus added, "like his mother." They named him Kai, which in Takoda's language meant willow, strong but flexible, able to bend in storms without breaking. The years that followed were not easy. The town remained divided. Some celebrated the family. Others muttered about mixing blood and breaking natural law. But Marcus and Takoda paid them no mind. They raised Kai in the small cabin that grew room by room, taught him to ride and track and read, gave him both his mother's warrior spirit and his father's steady heart. On Kai's 5th birthday, Marcus stood on the porch, watching his son play in the yard. Tall for his age already, showing his mother's genetics, but with Marcus's easy laugh. Takoda came to stand beside him, her hand finding his as it always did. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked at her, genuinely confused. "Regret what?" "Taking me in that first night. All the trouble it brought." Marcus turned to face her fully, brought his hand to her face. "Takoda, you and Kai are the only two things I've ever done right in my entire life. The rest was just me stumbling through until I found my purpose." She leaned into his touch. "I used to think love was weakness, that needing someone made you vulnerable. And now I know love is the only thing that makes us strong enough to survive." She looked at Kai, laughing as he chased a butterfly through tall grass. "He will grow up knowing his mother was Apache and his father was white, and that neither mattered as much as the fact that we chose each other every day." Marcus pulled her close, and they stood there watching their son, living proof that sometimes the world's cruelty could be answered with simple, stubborn kindness, that winter always ended if you survived it, that love didn't erase differences, but made them irrelevant. That evening, as stars emerged one by one over Bitterroot Valley, the family gathered on the porch. Takoda told stories of her warrior training. Marcus told stories of growing up on his father's ranch, and Kai listened with wide eyes, absorbing both halves of his heritage. "Will people always stare at us?" Kai asked, the question coming from his 5-year-old, understanding that their family was different. Takoda pulled him into her lap, still small enough for that, though not for much longer. "Yes, they will stare. Some will judge, But you will be strong enough to let them. How do you know? Marcus leaned forward. Because you come from two people who survived things that should have killed them, who found each other when the world said they had no right to, who built this family from nothing but determination and love. Kai thought about that, his young face serious. Then he smiled. I like our family. So do I, Marcus said. So do I, Takoda echoed. And in that moment, on that porch, under stars that had witnessed countless human dramas and would witness countless more, three people who had no business being a family sat together in perfect peace. Love, Marcus would later tell anyone who asked, wasn't some grand glowing miracle. It was the quiet persistence of two souls brave enough to face their own fears and each other's. It didn't promise shelter from storms, but it gave you someone to stand with when storms came. True love didn't seek perfection. It chose the person who saw you bruised and scarred and wild and stayed anyway. Out here in the wild places where people often lost themselves, love became the only compass that mattered. Simple, small, but always pointing home. Years later, when Marcus was gray and Kai had grown tall, 6'5", splitting the difference between his parents, and had children of his own, people would still ask about that winter. About the night Marcus Weylan found a wounded Apache warrior in his stable and made a choice that changed everything. Marcus would smile, reach for Takoda's hand, still strong, still there, and say simply, I didn't save her. We saved each other. And that was the truth. In a world that wanted to divide them, they'd chosen each other. In a winter that tried to kill them, they'd chosen to survive together. In a society that said their love was wrong, they'd chosen to let their life together be the only answer that mattered. The cabin still stands in Bitterroot Valley. Descendants of Marcus and Takoda still live there, still tell the story of the rancher and the warrior who proved that family isn't about blood or tradition or what the world expects. It's about who you choose when choosing is hard, who you stand with when standing costs everything, who you love when love requires courage. Sometimes the best stories aren't about heroes and villains. They're about ordinary people who make extraordinary choices, like opening your door to someone the world says you should fear, like trusting someone who has every reason not to trust, like building a family from nothing but winter and hope and stubborn refusal to let cold win. That's the story of Marcus and Takoda, and it's enough.